Hey all, your OS reviews. In this video, we're taking a quick look at the Cubot A30. This is a budget Android smartphone selling for under 130 bucks, and this is a brand that we have seen in the past producing mostly rugged Android phones. Cubot could be considered as an alternative to other brands like Doogee, Umidigi, and Unihertz, who are other options in a similar price range. But this year, they've been trying to branch out into making more regular phones, aka more stylish and slim devices that maybe loses out on some of the shock and military specifications that their other bulkier rugged phones offered, that has potential to be a little bit more mainstream. The first device from them that we saw under that theme was the X90, which is more of a mid-ranger that has flagship ambitions from having a curved OLED display, 120Hz, coupled with a very distinctive design going on. This time around though, the A30 being the more budget phone dials down many of those specs. It can be seen as a rival to devices like the new N10 as well as the Realme Note 50 that we also reviewed quite recently, because all three of these phones are packing pretty similar compute performance in the form here of a Unisoc T616 processor, which although by no means is a flagship killer, it is actually surprisingly decent enough when it comes to a really entry-level phone for handling the basics, as we've seen on these two other options. So it looks like these lower tier Unisoc processors are gaining a little bit more traction across the board. Now in comparison though, Cubot's main differentiator from a design perspective would be having a secondary display on the rear which measures 1.43 inches diagonally. It's a round screen, and this can be used to tell time information as well as show you basic notifications like calls or messages coming in, as well as act as a viewfinder for the rear camera. So it allows you to take slightly higher quality selfies compared to the front-facing camera, and again at 48 megapixels, this is a higher res sensor compared to both the new as well as the Realme phones, which are around 13 megapixels instead. Granted, higher megapixels doesn't always mean better camera automatically, but at least you are able to zoom and crop a little bit more. Other basic functions include taking a look at the battery status as well as controlling music that's playing back on the phone. So it's kind of like having a smartwatch screen attached onto the rear. Some may think it's a bit gimmicky, but it does make the phone a little bit more customizable because you're able to control things, including setting a different clock style as well on the rear, helping you more easily change the way that the phone looks from afar. That being said, again, it's not the first time that we've seen a secondary screen phone. Many companies in the past, including Xiaomi, as well as aforementioned Unihertz, as part of their TikTok rugged phone line, also implemented a similar design, as well as Cubot themselves on some of their past rugged phones have also tried this. But this is, I think, one of the more cost-effective budget phones that have also adopted this functionality. Now aside from that main 48 megapixel rear camera, there's also just a depth sensor for portrait bokeh effects, and that's it, with an LED flash. Now the construction quality of the A30 is built predominantly out of polycarbonate plastic, but doesn't feel too cheap or hollow. It has a decent density to it, doesn't really shake or rattle, and located on the right hand spine is going to be a volume rocker as well as a power key. Now one omission that is a little bit unfortunate is the A30 does not have a fingerprint scanner. However, you can rely on password pen or face unlock using the front-facing camera, though it's not going to be quite as secure. Considering those rivals from New and Realme did have a fingerprint scanner power button though, I would say that is a feature that I would like them to add in a next-gen revision to make it even more competitive. Now at the very bottom of the phone you'll find a USB Type-C for charging up the 5100 mAh capacity battery, and thankfully that ensures the phone can last pretty comfortably through around 2 or 3 days of use in my testing before I had to really recharge it again. However, the charging speed is on the slow side at only 10 watts, which is a trade-off on a lower end phone, but I think upgrading this to 18 watts at the minimum would have been also nice to have because of the larger capacity battery in here. Fully charging it from 0 to 100 can take over 2.5 hours to be specific. Now located on the other edge is going to be the SIM card / micro SD card slot for expanding on the 128 gigabytes of built-in storage, which is really not bad for an unlocked smartphone in this price range, and it supports 2 nano SIM cards, supporting 4G LTE for communication and also data. And that is it. So a pretty simple presentation, but some of the lines and edges here just make it seem perhaps a little bit more fashionable compared to many of its rivals. That being said, again, some omissions would be that fingerprint scanner, as well as not having a 3.5mm headphone jack, so you have to use a dongle or opt for wireless Bluetooth. And kind of as expected, it is going to be a single mono speaker at the bottom instead of being a stereo setup. One can argue that maybe having some of those touches upgraded might be more practical compared to having a secondary display, but obviously Cubot is prioritizing the fashion and design a little bit more here. It is indeed very slim and lightweight, I have to admit. For a phone that has a 5100 mAh battery, it is surprisingly easy to handle with just one hand. Otherwise, here on the front, we have a 6.75-inch HD plus resolution fast 90Hz refresh rate display. So the screen here is actually a little bit larger versus many of those other rivals by about 0.1 to 0.2 inches. You'll also find a factory pre-applied screen protector as well. We can peel off the top layer, but underneath there's still a film that protects the screen from any scratching. And other packaging contents are inclusive of a included hard shell case. It is transparent, allows you to still make out the color of the phone, which by the way, this version is in pink, but if you find that to be too glitzy, you can find it in a more traditional gray/black, with blue and purple versions of the phone also potentially becoming available in the near future. So overall, quite colorful from a design perspective, and it also features 6 GB of RAM, augmented with 10 GB of additional virtual RAM expansion. So you can borrow some of the ROM to simulate RAM and then help a bit when you are multitasking. So in total, you can get upwards of 16 GB with virtual RAM expansion. And that is one spec which is a little bit more powerful compared to both the N10 as well as the Note 50 there, which have either 3 or 4 GB of physical RAM. So it should be able to juggle a little bit more programs in the background without things closing up quite as much. And so in recap, I would say having that secondary screen as part of that design, as well as a higher res main camera and a bit more RAM, are kind of the main selling points for this particular budget device. By the way, the front-facing camera is going to be 16 megapixels, which is also a little higher than the 5 or 8 megapixels found on those two other devices. And some final packaging contents here are inclusive of a bundled wall adapter, again 10 watts, along with a USB Type-C to Type-A cable. And underneath here, you'll find a SIM ejector pin, along with some quick start guides, and they even give you a tempered screen protector in the box as well. This will add even more impact resistance to the screen. So there's both a film one pre-applied and then a second protector thrown in. So it's good to see they didn't skimp on the accessories, even though it's a budget phone. Ironically enough, many flagship devices give you less in the box. Closer look here at the UI, it's thankfully a fairly clean version of Android 14. They haven't given you too much bloatware here, aside from a voice recorder as well as a pedometer app. Everything else though is pretty much a stock to Android, including the Play Store. Again, the screen here is pretty expansive, although it is using a teardrop notch compared to a hole punch cutout, but it's still relatively minimal. Slightly larger chin at the bottom though, but the overall display quality itself doesn't seem to be too shabby. It is fully laminated, there is no gap between the glass and the LCD underneath, and as an IPS panel, thankfully viewing angles are still pretty decent. Visibility when you're in direct sunlight is going to struggle a little bit more, but if you are in shaded regions or indoors, it actually looks quite good. There's also a Google News feed here on the left of the home screen, pretty classic, as well as dragging down here to access some quick shortcuts, and there's also no NFC built on in, so whether that's a deal breaker or not is going to depend on your personal use case. But if you want to use wallet functionalities on your device, you may have to shell out a little bit more for one of the more mid-range devices to get that capability. Closer look at settings, you do have some smart controls including screen recording built on in, as well as the ability for you to access the aforementioned virtual RAM expansion. There's also scheduled power on and off capability, so it can turn off, for example, at certain times in the day, maybe if you're busy working or sleeping, and then turn on by itself for some automation control. Under display properties, you're also able to change some of the color and contrast options to be a little bit more saturated, cooler versus warmer, which is good to see, as well as a video display enhancement function, similar to HDR, adding a bit more pop if you are consuming videos on YouTube, for instance. There's also going to be the screen refresh rate if you want to dial it down to 60 Hz to consume less power, or 90 to feel a bit more smooth as you're swiping up and down. Pocket mode here will prevent any accidental triggers when the phone is not being used, as well as having adaptive brightness using a proximity light sensor next to the earpiece that can change the brightness of the screen automatically. And gestures like flipping the phone around if you want to mute an incoming call or alarm. On top of all the standard Android 14 features that we've come to expect, you'll also find another section here for mini screen, which is that rear display on the back. So from here, you're also able to change the kind of clock style a little bit more easily, looking through all the options, and also tapping on Add to create your own, customizing the dial as well as the clock marks. In addition, you can add components like the battery percentage, pedometer that tells you how many steps you've walked, and even upload your own photo to act as the background. That is quite similar to a smartwatch. You're also able to change the timeout settings, the screen brightness, as well as you can enable functions like double tap to wake the screen, whether you want incoming calls to light up the screen as well to give you an alert, again similar to a smart wearable device, as well as what types of notifications you want to pass through onto that rear display, which can be a little bit more discreet if you have your phone face down, for instance. And we can verify that the phone is indeed running on Android 14. That being said, similar to aforementioned brands here like New, because Cubot is a smaller brand, and this is one of the most inexpensive budget phone offerings, I don't really anticipate this getting too much OS level upgrades beyond this point, but occasional firmware updates to improve on the system's stability will still be provided. It's something that we've mentioned before, but hopefully more of these smaller brands and players will continue to leverage even longer term OS level support to make their offerings more competitive. Although I guess for phones in the around $100 price range, perhaps we can be a little bit more lenient, since the profit margins are probably thinner as well, but it is what it is. Cubot also gives you some home screen settings, allowing you to change whether you want to opt for universal app tray, in which you can drag up to access the full list of programs similar to stock Android, but you can also choose a version here that kind of simulates iOS by having virtual pages that will expand as you install more applications, disabling the drag up notification tray. So you can choose between those options. Interestingly, they've also provided some of their custom wallpaper options as well. So for example, this one here is called Red. It is also matching the whole fashion phone theme that they're going after here despite the low price point, particularly this kind of subtle pink shade. Seems to be a reasonable match for this dynamic rose wallpaper that will flash a little bit more aggressively as you are moving and interacting with the screen, with some other options here being perhaps a little bit more subtle from a color perspective, like this one here called Gradient, also looking quite pretty, and again showing off the colors of the IPS screen here quite well. Again, it's not shabby looking for a budget phone screen, even though it doesn't have the highest PPI. And moving into some specific programs next, starting with the camera, I would say the layout is quite familiar compared to past Cubot devices we've seen. There is HDR that you can turn on in conjunction with AI scene detection, changing some of the properties like color and contrast depending on objects that you're pointing it at. So for example, food versus nature scenes, along with control over whether you want to mute the camera sound or not, change the resolution of the photos, as you can tell here. By default, it will be binning down to 12 megapixels, so combining 4 pixels into one, but you can also shoot in the full 48 megapixel mode located in a separate tab. You can also enable watermarks as well as composition grid lines, and there's also an audio control method where it will use the microphone to detect if you're saying a key phrase and then take a shot, which is a neat idea, but unfortunately it looks like the key phrase is in Chinese instead of English like cheese or capture an image. Hopefully they update that part in the future. And now you can also find some built-in scenes down below here, so you can take that instead of editing it in post, as well as Google Lens support as well for scanning objects as well as barcodes. Now further swiping here, we have the aforementioned ultra res mode that will be capturing at the full 48 megapixels, but you no longer get access to HDR or AI scene detection in this mode. There's also the portrait mode that uses one of the depth sensors there to blur out the background, and you're also able to choose the intensity. The portrait mode even gives you some simulated iPhone features, including a studio lighting, as well as contour lighting effects, also using that depth sensor. And by the way, in all of these modes, you can still access a beauty effect as well for brightening and also hiding some skin imperfections. And as far as video is concerned, resolution here is capped at full HD, but that's also expected compared to the competition here, with EIS available for video stabilization, but as expected, there is no OIS at this price range. Finally, tucked away under more, you'll also find time-lapse, panorama, as well as a pro mode, adjusting properties like ISO and white balance a little bit more manually, as well as a night mode can also be found here, increasing the exposure time to let in more light, but you have to hold still while the phone takes a few extra seconds to capture the shot. And taking a quick look at some examples here, this one is using the default 12 megapixels with AI scene detection, and by the way, this is as far in as we can zoom into the shot, compared to this one that looks a little bit darker because there is no HDR or high dynamic range, but you are able to zoom and crop a little bit more at the full 48 megapixels. So if you are doing more cropping, this might be one benefit, but keep in mind that the picture size will also be larger. So the regular one here, it takes up around 2.7 megabytes compared to the full one taking around 11 megabytes. Also, the night mode is effective if you are patient and hold relatively still. In this example, the sun was almost fully set, but I was still able to squeeze in a little bit more light using this method, catching some of those final autumn leaves there. And also with the HDR, you can still retain a little bit of detail in some of the textures of the sky, as you can tell. So overall, I wouldn't say that it's going to be a class-leading camera necessarily if you're pairing it against a Google Pixel or an iPhone, of course. But at the very least, images are pretty fast to snap, and also a little bit higher res compared to the 12 megapixel sensors. So for the price range, I would say the camera performance is actually really not bad. In most scenarios, it gets the job done, as long as you have reasonable expectations. Here's also a quick web browsing test, and we can tell that the reception quality, because of the plastic chassis, also seems to be quite strong, using dual-band Wi-Fi, as well as 4G LTE with T-Mobile here in the Seattle region. Web pages actually don't take too long at all to load back. We can also request the full desktop site, which is going to be a little bit more complex here, plenty of videos, ads, and scrolling elements. But as you can tell here, the Unisoc T616 is handling it surprisingly well. So echoing our remarks from our reviews on these two other phones, because they are using comparable processors, this is roughly equivalent to something like a MediaTek Helio G80, if not a touch faster in some aspects. So it's a decent enough choice, particularly on a budget phone like this, also comparable with some of the previous gen Snapdragon 600 series processors. Point being, what was previously more of a mid-ranger in terms of performance is now trickling down onto more of the budget end, even on newer phones like this. So you don't have to be waiting too long. Unlike $100 phones in the past, it's really no longer frustrating to use the device. In fact, it's perfectly serviceable, just giving it a split second longer to initially load, and afterwards I was still quite pleased when it came to just web browsing, handling the basics. And again, with up to 16 gigabytes of virtual RAM expansion, it has a little bit better multitasking capability compared to some of those rivals that we've seen. It does help it keep a few extra tabs in the browser open without things refreshing or reloading quite as often. So if you're just using this for reading back articles and news pages, honestly, it's still going to be a perfectly sufficient experience. And now exploring the audio quality, playing back a YouTube clip. So takeaway is that single speaker, thankfully, gets reasonably loud and doesn't sound too tinny or thin even at higher volume levels. It gets the job done. But again, having a standard headphone jack, particularly on a budget phone, is kind of a staple that I wish they wouldn't have removed. But at the very least, you can always rely on wireless headphones and buds if you prefer. And otherwise, again, video consumption seems to be good enough thanks to the large 6.7-inch display, so at least colors and moving images, as you can tell here, actually look pretty cinematic. Loading times also aren't too problematic with the decent antenna reception quality on the phone, taking just a split second if you are scrubbing between parts of the video, as you can tell. So more than usable enough for quick YouTube clips and some shorter Netflix shows that you might be consuming. Also supporting picture-in-picture mode as well without too many problems. And as far as doing a little bit of gaming, if you're keeping things quite casual, more of these tap-and-go style games like Crossy Road or puzzle-type games, it definitely can be handled without too many problems, as you can tell here. Actually is working just fine as long as you give it a split second longer for it to initially load the title at the very beginning. That being said, if you are playing back more demanding games, although it is perfectly capable of running even Asphalt, Minecraft, as well as PUBG, you do have to be a bit more patient and also lower some of the graphic settings for better experience. It's not going to be really a pro gamer's phone in that sense. But once again, if you're having reasonable expectations, it can still be a perfectly usable experience. Again, for casual gaming at the very least, I think it actually performs a little bit better than expected. Other social media apps as well, again, run here just fine and look actually not bad on a larger screen, plus it's not super heavy, as aforementioned, because of the plastic chassis, very slim, so it doesn't really strain your hands either as you're using it for a little bit longer. Now when it comes to phone call quality and also the microphone, doing a quick test here, this is what the microphone sounds like. Test, test, 1, 2, 3. Test here, this is what the microphone sounds like. Test, test, 1, 2, 3. It's also surprisingly quite clean and crisp sounding, plus with a slightly larger screen size, the microphone is a little bit closer to your mouth as well. So for things like phone calls, it can definitely handle those basics without too many problems. That being said, unlike some other rugged phones, you don't get as many additional sensors for features like a compass or even an FM radio, since there is no, again, standard 3.5mm headphone jack. But again, the core features here are actually not bad from a performance point of view. And that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the Cubot A30. Again, the main story here is having a relatively stylish entry-level phone in this price range with a large battery but still surprisingly slim and lightweight, coupled with a decent enough processor and RAM for it to run pretty smoothly for handling the basics. It once again shows that budget phones have come a long way, echoing our remarks from some of these previous devices that also impressed us. So whether or not this device is the one for you, and if you prefer it more than these two other offerings, I think comes down to whether or not you like this design or not. It is a little bit more, I guess, flashy when we place them side by side. Again, this one having just a slightly higher res camera both on the front as well as the rear, as well as a little bit more RAM. That definitely helps in terms of the system performance, but at the same time, these two devices both have a standard headphone jack, as well as the N10 having stereo speaker support, and the Realme Note 50 having IP rating. So they all have slightly different pros and cons, but general level of usability is going to be quite similar across the board. Not bad, I would say, for this price range. You can check out more details if you are interested in the links down below, but for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews, another ultra budget new Android smartphone that has been the Cubot A30.